Greetings, young historians. Welcome back to the final episode of Chapter 23, The Earth and Its Peoples. Here we are with our AP World History Fireside. We are picking up where we left off on Section 4, Revolution Spreads, Conservatives Respond. We are on page 592. As usual, I suggest you take your own notes. Even as the dictatorship of Napoleon eliminated the democratic legacy of the French Revolution, revolutionary ideology was spreading and taking hold in Europe and the Americas. In Europe, the French Revolution promoted nationalism and republicanism. In the Americas, the legacy of the American and French revolutions led to a new round of struggles for independence. News of the revolutionary events in France destabilized the colonial regime of Saint-Dominique, present-day Haiti, remember back at the beginning of the chapter, a small French colony on the western half of the island of Hispaniola, and resulted in the first successful slave rebellion. In Europe, however, the spread of revolutionary fervor was checked by a reaction to monarchs formed in alliance to protect themselves from further revolutionary outbreaks. So now the kings are getting together and saying, we have to stop this democratic business from taking us out of power. This will not do. In 1789, the French colony of Saint-Dominique was among the richest European colonies. I'm saying that wrong. Saint-Domingue was among the richest European colonies in the Americas. Its plantations produced sugar, cotton, indigo, and coffee. The colony produced 2/3 of France's tropical imports and generated nearly 1/3 of all French foreign trade. It's a pretty substantial amount for one small island. This impressive wealth depended on a brutal slave regime. Saint-Domingue's harsh punishments and poor living conditions were notorious throughout the Caribbean. If you were a slave, you did not want to get sent there. The colony's high mortality and low fertility rates created an insatiable demand for African slaves. High mortality rates, people were dying of all kinds of disease. So the only way to get more employees that were free, was to bring in more African slaves. As a result, the majority of the colony's 500,000 slaves in 1790 were African-born. So we have a French colony in the Caribbean full of people from Africa. Talk about cultural diffusion. In 1789, when news of the calling of France's Estates General arrived on the island, wealthy white planters sent a delegation to Paris charged with seeking more home rule and greater economic freedom for Saint-Domingue. The free mixed-race population also sent representatives. These delegates were mostly drawn from the large class of slave-owning small planters and urban merchants. So this colony is saying, we want representation too. They focused on gaining an end to race discrimination and the achievement of political equality with whites. Only whites. They did not seek freedom for slaves, because the most prosperous gens de couleur, which is mixed race people, were slave owners themselves. Wow. As the French Revolution became more radical, the gens de couleur forged an alliance with sympathetic French radicals, who came to identify the colony's wealthy planters as royalists and aristocrats. The political turmoil in France weakened the ability of colonial administrators to maintain order. So there's nobody back at home on the mainland to back you up if there's some kind of rebellion on the colony. And obviously the slaves were aware of this. The authority of colonial officials was no longer clear, and the very legitimacy of slavery was being challenged in France. In the vacuum that resulted, rich planters, poor whites, and the gens de couleur each pursued their own narrow interests, engendering an increasingly bitter and confrontational struggle. So everybody's looking out for themselves. Given the slaves' hatred of the brutal regime that had oppressed them, and the accumulated grievances of the free people of color, there was no way to limit the violence once the control of slave owners slipped. So once the slaves figured out that they could rebel, they did rebel. When Vincent Auger, leader of the Gens de Couleur mission to France, returned to Saint-Domingue to organize a military force, planter forces captured, tortured, and executed him. This cruelty was soon repaid in kind. By 1791, whites, led by the planter elite and the Gens de Couleur, were engaged in open warfare. This breach between the two groups of slave owners gave the slaves an opening. So you have the elite, who are the wealthy, and the Gens de Couleur, who are mixed race, but they're also slave owners, but more middle upper class, are fighting. And as they are busy fighting each other, the slaves see an opportunity. The slave rebellion began on the plantations of the north and spread throughout the colony. There's a map on the opposite page of this page, 23.3. Plantations were destroyed, masters and overseers killed, crops were burned. An emerging rebel leadership that combined elements of African political culture with revolutionary ideology from France mobilized and directed the rebelling slaves. So the slaves have been hearing, and in some cases even reading, this rhetoric about democracy and all the stuff that's going on in France in terms of revolution, and they have their own ideas about government structure that they bring with them from Africa, and they plan to implement them. The rebellious slaves eventually gained the upper hand under the leadership of François Domingue Toussaint Louverture, a former domestic slave who created a more disciplined military force. Toussaint was politically strengthened in 1794 when the Radical National Convention in Paris abolished slavery in all French possessions. He overcame his rivals in Saint-Domingue, defeated a British expeditionary force in 1798. The British tried to get in on it, and led an invasion of neighboring San Domingo, freeing the slaves there. Toussaint continued to assert his loyalty to France, but gave the French government no effective role in local affairs. As reaction overtook revolution in France, both the abolition of slavery and Toussaint's political position were threatened. When the Directory contemplated the reestablishment of slavery, Toussaint protested. Do they think that men who have been able to enjoy the blessing of liberty will calmly see it snatched away? They supported their chains only so long as they did not know any condition of life more happy than slavery. But today, when they have left it, if they had 1,000 lives, they would sacrifice them all rather than be forced into slavery again. We have tasted freedom and will not go back to being enslaved. In 1802, Napoleon sent a large military force to Saint-Domingue to reestablish both French authority and slavery. At first, the French forces were successful. Toussaint was captured and sent to France, where he died in prison. Eventually, however, the loss of thousands of lives to yellow fever and the resistance of revolutionaries turned the tide. So Napoleon's soldiers, a lot of them die of yellow fever. Visible in the resistance to the French were small numbers of armed women. During the early stages of the Haitian Revolution, very few slave women had taken up arms, although many had aided Toussaint's forces in support roles. But after a decade of struggle and violence, more Haitian women were politically aware and willing to join the armed resistance. In 1804, Toussaint's successors declared independence, and the Free Republic of Haiti joined the United States as the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. But independence and emancipation were achieved at a terrible price. The public administration was corrupted by more than a decade of violence. Political violence and economic stagnation were to trouble Haiti throughout the 19th century and the 20th and today. From 1814 to 1815, the representatives of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia met as the Congress of Vienna to reestablish political order in Europe. While they were meeting, Napoleon had escaped from Elba and was defeated at Waterloo. The French Revolution and Napoleon's imperial ambitions had threatened the very survival of European old order. Ancient monarchies had been overturned and dynasties replaced with interlopers. Long-established political institutions had been tossed aside, and long-recognized international borders had been ignored. The very existence of the nobility and church had been put at risk, so everything that was once normal is no longer. Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich, and the Allies working together in Vienna created a comprehensive peace settlement that they hoped would safeguard the conservative order. The central objection of the Conference of Vienna was to roll back the clock in France. They're trying to restore monarchy in France. Because the participants believed in strong, stable France was the best guarantee of future peace, the French monarchy was reestablished and France's 1792 borders were recognized. Most of the continental European powers received some territorial gains, for Metternich sought to offset French strength with a balance of power. In addition, Austria, Russia, and Prussia formed a separate alliance to confront more actively the revolutionary and nationalist energies that the French Revolution had unleashed. In 1820, this Holy Alliance acted decisively to defeat liberal revolutions in Spain and Italy. So, these guys are working together to keep other countries from getting on this whole revolution bandwagon. By repressing Republican and nationalist ideas in universities and the press, the Holy Alliance also attempted to meet the potential challenge hosted by subversive ideas. Metternich's program of conservative retrenchment succeeded in short term. But powerful ideas associated with liberalism and nationalism remained a vital part of European political life throughout the 19th century. And that's a theme, nationalism, that's going to come up again and again as we discuss military conflicts in Europe from this point forward. Despite the power of conservative monarchs, popular support for national self-determination and democratic reform grew throughout Europe. Greece had been under Ottoman control since the 15th century. In 1821, Greek patriots launched an independence movement. Metternich and other conservatives opposed Greek independence, because as they do, they try to put down any revolutions. But European artists and writers, enamored with the cultural legacy of ancient Greece, rallied political support for intervention. After years of struggle, Russia, France, and Great Britain forced the Ottoman Empire to recognize Greek independence in 1830. Louis XVIII, brother of executed Louis XVI, had been placed on the throne of France by the victorious Allies in 1814. He ruled as a constitutional monarch until his death in 1824, and was followed to the throne by his brother, Charles X. Charles attempted to rule in the pre-revolutionary style of his ancestors. He was not down with this whole constitutional monarchy business. I'm the king. Repudiating the Constitution in 1830. Unwilling to accept this reactionary challenge, the people of Paris rose up and forced Charles to abdicate. The people of Paris, we are not having it. His successor was his cousin Louis Philippe, who accepted the re-established constitution and extended voting privileges. At the same time, in both the United States and Great Britain, democratic reform movements appeared. In the United States, after 1790, new states with constitutions granting voting rights to most free males joined the original 13 states, so the U.S. is growing. After the War of 1812, the right to vote was expanded in all the older states as well. So, if you are a man, you can vote. You don't have to own land, but you have to be a man and you do have to be white. This broadening of the franchise led in 1828 to the election of populist President Andrew Jackson. However, revolutionary violence in France made the British aristocracy and the conservative Tory party fearful of expanded democracy and mass movements of any kind. In 1850, the British government passed the Corn Laws, which limited the importance of foreign grains. This law favored the profits of wealthy landowners who produced grains at the expense of the poor who were forced to pay more for bread. Okay, so it was cheaper to import grains, so products were less expensive if you imported the grain, because you could buy it at reduced prices from other countries. But the government says, no, we will not import any foreign grains. You have to buy domestic grains. And so, being the only providers of grain in the country, the domestic planters could charge any price they wanted. And they charged a high price because they wanted to make the most possible profit. When the poor consumers organized to overturn these laws, the government outlawed most public meetings, using troops to crush protest in Manchester. Reacting against these policies, reformers gained the passage of laws that increased the power of the House of Commons. This redistributed votes from agricultural to industrial districts and increased the number of voters by nearly 50%. Although the most radical demands of these reformers, called the Chartists, were defeated, new labor and economic reforms addressing the grievances of workers were passed. This is in Great Britain, mind you. Despite the achievement of Greek independence and limited political reform in France and Great Britain, conservatives continued to hold the upper hand in Europe. Finally, in 1848, the desire for democratic reform and national self-determination and the frustration of urban workers led to upheaval across Europe. The revolutions of 1848 began in Paris, where members of the middle class and workers united to overthrow the regime of Louis Philippe and create the Second French Republic. Adult men were given voting rights, slavery was abolished in French colonies, and the death penalty was ended. A 10-hour workday was legislated for Paris. But Parisian workers' demands for programs to reduce unemployment and lower prices provoked conflicts with the middle class, which wanted to protect property rights. So originally the middle and lower class are working together, and then at some point they start to disagree about what is best. When workers rose up against the government, French troops were called in to crush them. Desiring the reestablishment of order, the French elected Louis Napoleon, nephew of the former emperor, to the presidency in December of 1848. 3 years later, he overturned the Constitution, and after ruling briefly as a dictator, became Emperor Napoleon III and remained in power until 1871. So, still in France, we are not seeing the establishment of a democracy. Government's too weak. Reformers in Hungary, Italy, Bohemia, and elsewhere pressed for greater national self-determination in 1848. When the Austrian monarchy hesitated to meet such demands, students and workers in Vienna took to the streets to force political reforms similar to those sought in Paris. With revolution spreading throughout the Austrian Empire, Metternich, the symbol of reaction, fled Vienna in disguise. Little lasting change occurred, however, because the new Austrian emperor, Franz Joseph, was able to use the Russian military assistance and loyal Austrian troops to reestablish central authority. So attempts in Austria to revolt were put down by the military and help from the Russian military. Middle-class reformers and workers in Berlin joined forces in an attempt to compel the Prussian king to accept a liberal constitution and seek unification of the German states. But the Constituent Assembly called to write a constitution and arrange for national integration became entangled in diplomatic conflicts with Austria and Denmark. So this guy they've called upon to write a constitution is busy arguing with people about other stuff. As a result, Frederick William IV was able to reassert his authority, thwarting both constitutional reform and unification. So again, revolution fail. Despite their heroism on the barricades of Paris, Vienna, Rome, and Berlin, the revolutionaries of 1848 failed to gain either their nationalist or republican objectives. Monarchs retained their support not only of aristocrats but also of professional militaries. Is having a military key to retaining power? That's something we're going to discuss in class. These militaries were largely recruited from among peasants who had little sympathy for urban workers. Revolutionary coalitions, in contrast, were fragile and lacked clear objectives. It's just a bunch of mad people, so they can't organize very well. Workers' demands for higher wages, lower prices, and labor reform often drove their middle-class allies into the arms of reactionaries. The conclusion. This era of revolution was in large a measure of the product of a long period of costly warfare in the imperial nations of Europe. Using taxes and institutions inherited from the past, England and France found it increasingly difficult to fund distant wars in the Americas or in Asia. The royal governments attempting to impose new taxes met with angry resistance. The spread of literacy and greater availability of books helped create a European culture more open to reform or revolutionary change of existing institutions. The ideas of Locke and Rousseau guided critics of monarchy toward new political culture of elections and representative institutions. Each new development served as an example and a provocation for new revolutionary acts. So these revolutions happen in pieces over time, not as one war as the American Revolution occurred. French officers who took part in the American Revolution helped ignite the French Revolution. Black freemen from Haiti traveled to France to seek rights and returned to spread revolutionary passions. Each revolution had its own character. The revolutions in France and Haiti proved to be more violent and destructive than the American revolutions. Revolutions in France and Haiti, facing a more strongly entrenched and more powerful opposition to greater social inequalities, responded with greater violence. The conservative reentrenchment that followed the defeat of Napoleon succeeded in the short term. So, reorganizing and having ultimate authority works for a while. Monarchy, multinational empires, and the established church retained their hold on the loyalty of millions of Europeans and could count on the support of many of Europe's wealthiest and most powerful individuals. But liberalism and nationalism continued to stir revolutionary sentiment. So the major revolutions may go away, but the ideas are still floating around. The contest between adherents of the old order and the partisans of change was to continue well into the 19th century. In the end, the nation-state, the Enlightenment legacy of rational inquiry, broadened political participation, and secular intellectual culture were to prevail. Ultimately, although not in this time period, these ideas of secular thought, keeping the church out of government, and having representative democracy will win out in Europe. This outcome was determined in large measure by the old order's inability to satisfy the new social classes that appeared with the emerging industrial economy. The material transformation produced by industrial capitalism could not be contained in the narrow confines of a hereditary social system, nor could the rapid expansion of scientific learning be contained with the doctrines of traditional religion. Once people start having ideas about things, there's no going back. And in terms of the economy, we haven't talked about the Industrial Revolution yet, but people started to have the ability to make money and rise from their social class. And that's going to change the way people think. Money changes everything. The revolutions of the late 18th century began the transformation of Western society, but they did not complete it. Only a minority gained full political rights. Women achieved full political rights only in the 20th century. Democratic institutions, as in revolutionary France, often failed. In Chapter 25, we will discuss how slavery endured in the Americas past the mid-1800s, despite the revolutionary era's enthusiasm for individual liberty. not all men are created equal. If you need slaves to make bank. Okay, so key terms that you need to take away from Chapter 23, Enlightenment, Jacobins, Constitutional Convention, Estates General, National Assembly, Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then some people you should know: Ben Franklin, George Washington, Joseph Brant, Maximilien Robespierre, Napoleon Bonaparte, Francois Dominique, Toussaint Louverture, and that's it. So that is the end of Chapter 23. I will be skipping in the next episode to Chapter 25 because it relates more to this chapter, and then we'll come back to Chapter 24 after that. Thank you for joining me. Have a great day.